So I was putting a stethoscope on 2,000 to 3,000 other people's hearts, while my own heart was confused, had very little language in my mind to communicate what was being felt in my own heart. And yet here I was, pretending to be a helper and a healer of others' hearts.
I'm Heather Grzych, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrzych.com or on Instagram at heathergrzych. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. Today, I'm here with Jonathan Fisher. Dr. Jonathan Fisher is on a personal mission to help others train the mind and heal the heart. He is a Harvard-trained clinical cardiologist, mindfulness meditation teacher, and organizational well-being and resiliency leader at Novant Health for a team of 38,000 people. He has delivered keynotes and workshops on heartful leadership, stress mastery, and total well-being for teams and organizations globally, including IBM, Bank of America, IE Business School, the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, along with universities and healthcare organizations. In 2020, he co-founded the Ending Physician Burnout Global Community and organized the world's first global summit dedicated to ending physician burnout with over 1,000 participants from 43 countries. His forthcoming book, Just One Heart, offers a practical guide to the mind-heart connection. Jonathan, thank you so much for being here today. I'm so excited to be with you.
Heather, it's my pleasure. I love what you're doing with this podcast and all the wisdom that you share. Just excited to be in conversation.
Yeah, I'm really excited to dive on this topic of the mind-heart connection, which I feel has the potential to take us into perhaps some woo-woo territory, some very welcome woo-woo territories. But you being a cardiologist and working in the physical world, I know that this will be very grounded sort of woo-woo, right?
Yeah, exactly. Literally known as like a lone nut in my field sometimes because I go out there and it's part of my mission to push the boundaries a little bit about the traditional ways that we approach heart healing, because I think many of the Western models and approaches to healing hearts are missing about 99% of what's available to us.
Wow, that's a big statement. I'm really excited to hear why you think that. You know, that's a very large percentage. And you're spending a lot of time thinking about this idea of the mind-heart connection, clearly, because that's something you're writing a book about right now, also being a cardiologist. So I want to talk about that. I also want to talk about this passion that you have for what's going on with physicians and patients in the healthcare system. Those are topics I'm very passionate about as well. And yeah, so I was hoping we could start today just very easy. What is the mind-heart connection?
To answer that, we have to ask what is the mind, and then we have to ask what is the heart, and then we can talk about how they're connected. And definitions of the mind have changed over the last few thousand years. And for me, the mind is not simply something that sits in the brain. That was the traditional thinking. And in the East, the knowledge of the mind comes from all over the body. And now we are starting to think about the gut brain and the heart brain and the brain brain. And so I would offer an expanded notion of what the mind is in the first place, just blowing beyond the confines of the skull and any part of the body that is able to sense and to feel and to provide access to what's happening around us. Information is then processed by the mind in this deeply interconnected way. So for me, that's the mind. It's something that processes the information happening from within the body and from outside the body so that we can then take some form of wise action, whether instantaneously on a reflex basis or more thoughtfully involving the prefrontal cortex. So that's how I think about the mind. In terms of the heart and why I said that we're often missing the boat on the heart, if you would say, well, where's the heart? Everyone would point right here. And most people, except for those who were born with the heart on the opposite side, and there are people whose...
I know someone who has that.
There you go. And works perfectly normal, but it's a mirror image of the natural position. And people would point right here, and most doctors would say the heart lives here. Now, if you go back in time to 100 years, 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 3,000 years, travel to any tradition, wisdom tradition, religious tradition, they would point to the chest, but they wouldn't necessarily point to the heart. The heart was the same as the soul. The heart was the same as the seat of all emotional experience, all mental experience. The heart was the brain. If you go back to Aristotle, he believed that the only purpose of the brain itself was to clean the blood after the heart was done doing its job. And so we've sort of gotten away from this idea of the heart as the root and seat of emotions. And now we're moving backwards as modern science is offering research showing the deep connection between what we can call negative emotions. I don't love the term negative. We can get into that. What we can call positive emotions like joy and love. There is sort of a teeter-totter effect. Certain emotions have a literal negative impact on the function of the heart and can lead to disease. Or other more positive, pro-social, generative, creative emotions that we can fill ourselves with intention have a protective effect on the beating heart. So the mind-heart connection is that internal flow of information between aspects of the mind and aspects of the physical and emotional heart that can then be harnessed like a lever and move more towards the brain or the mind, depending on what we're engaged in, or we can shift and really amplify those powers of the heart so we can connect with others and others' hearts and minds.
I'm really excited to hear you say that well, I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but it sounded to me that you were going to challenge this idea that the emotions that we feel that are good are always good, and the emotions that we feel that are bad are always bad. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that from you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to back up and say that I had no education in emotions. Not in my household growing up. We were a bunch of nerdy scientists going into physics and medicine. Not in medical school. I had a psychiatry rotation, but this was my experience. They said, well, we're going to unlock a door. You're going to go through the door and welcome to the world of people with mental illness. That was my introduction to what I now think is a beautiful part of the human experience. And really, it was quite traumatic. It was the opposite. I was exposed immediately to really severe psychopathology where people were acting out. And it almost became something that I was afraid of. So I had to undo that experience, had to go through my own recovery from emotional trauma, physical injury, etc., and grief to learn that the emotions themselves are not things to be judged as either positive or negative. So there's no such thing as a bad emotion or a negative emotional state in my mind. I think to characterize them as such immediately creates a judgment inside of ourselves about an internal experience. The same way that if I have pain in my knee and I say, oh, my darn knee, it's hurting again. I wish I didn't have this pain. Immediately there, I'm very sensitive to the fact I've then created an internal conflict. And I've learned one thing that applies to any distress or stress, and that's anytime I have conflict inside of myself or about my own experience, I'm going to lose. Because either as the one who is judging my own experience or the one who is being judged by the negative voice, there's inner conflict. And so when it comes to emotions, rather than viewing fear or pain or grief as negative emotions, I view them as information. And that's the way they evolved. Evolutionary psychology says that we didn't evolve with negative or positive emotions. We evolved with physiologic changes in our body that were designed to keep us safe and to procreate. Some of these have a net attractive effect towards whatever's happening in our world, and some of them cause us to run away. So the end result of all emotions is either to draw us closer to some stimulus or event or to push us away. Some are more neutral, but that doesn't mean the emotions themselves are either positive or negative. They can all be used to identify what's most valuable to us, most important to us in terms of our core principles for living.
Is that rotation that you experienced in psychiatry, is that kind of what led you to be, because at that point, had you decided to be a cardiologist, or were you still thinking about where to go?
I was very much mind wide open. In college, I was interested in physics and biology, in art and art history. And I knew that I wanted to put together science with service to other people. That was important to me. And what appealed to me about the heart from early on was that it's the most kinetic organ in the body. There's movement, there's systole, the squeezing, diastole, the relaxation, phases in between. And then there's electrochemistry. And so it has all the aspects that a nerdy kid from New Jersey would love. And at the same time, I knew at that time, but I only had the faintest glimpse that there was this deeper emotional and psycho-spiritual aspect of healing hearts that was there. I was more needing to do that work on myself for a good 15 years before I could share it with my patients and with my colleagues. And so I had a glimmer of that in my psychiatry rotation, and I was turned off to the field of psychiatry during that rotation itself.
Yeah. So you've been in practice for a while. So this idea of the mind-heart connection has this with you for a very long time, for you to go this deep into this.
It actually only came up about 13 years ago. So I graduated medical school 25 years ago. I spent a good 10 years doing my cardiology training and fellowship, went into a practice in New York City. And I was still at that time what you would consider a pretty traditional Western medical heart doctor. You would come to me, I would listen to you, I would show you empathy and care, and then I would prescribe a test or a medication, and eventually maybe a procedure, and I would bring you back and find out how it went. At the same time, I was hiding my own internal struggle with all of my patients, and there were 2,000 to 3,000 patients I would see a year. So I was putting a stethoscope on 2,000 to 3,000 other people's hearts, while my own heart was confused, had very little language in my mind to communicate what was being felt in my own heart. And yet here I was pretending to be a helper and a healer of others' hearts. So to answer your question, it only was after my heart completely broke, was on the floor of my New York City apartment after my sister was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor at the age of 44 with a small child. And she had been my best friend and really mentor in how to experience life in a meaningful, rich way, when all the forces of my education and training were pointing me towards accomplishment, achievement, and external validation. And so it was that moment on the floor, just weeping, curled up like a baby, this grown man who was seeing thousands of people to help their own hearts. And I really realized I needed to get a clue about how to deal with my own grief, with what was unaddressed anxiety, and what I later would find out was untreated depression. And so that, Heather, was the beginning of me having to explore modalities and avenues outside the traditional model, and also to question the norms of the Western medical training system that had taken a sensitive child who was ready to receive the wisdom of my own heart and others, but instead lost it gradually over the years. And I wasn't alone. So I committed myself at that time to learn everything I could about what real healing was, about what hearts really needed. And then, in the spirit of service and a scientist, I committed to sharing whatever it was I was learning at the moment I was learning it, which for me took tremendous courage, because when I went in 2012, this is when mindfulness was sort of becoming something. People didn't talk about compassion. I spoke in my hospital to other doctors about the science of mindfulness and meditation as it relates to healing hearts. And I got a lot of funny looks. So for me, that was the beginning of, 10 years of diving as deep as I could into this whole, really, I think, untapped area of how do we strengthen the connection between the mind and the heart that's already there, and what happens when we actually do that.
Thank you so much, first of all, for sharing your story. That's very, very powerful, and can't imagine going through that, especially when somebody has a kid. It's the worst.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I hope that child is doing well.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, because I have a little kid, so that really oh my God, guts me for sure. Yeah. And, to hear you talk about how in 2012, I think that was 2 years after I did my yoga teacher training. And so that was around the time in the years where I think I was kind of going through a similar type of reconnection, right? Which many people experience at some point in their lives, and comes in different forms and is supported by different wisdom traditions oftentimes. And, to hear you say earlier and talk about Aristotle and these sort of ancient views of the heart and what it is. And in Ayurveda, it's referred to, it's Hridaya Chetanam Sthanam, which is the heart is the seat of consciousness, which is basically what all these ancient systems have been saying for a long time. And yet your own experience of being in the practice of medicine to heal these hearts with that kind of disconnection that was happening, I don't think that's uncommon. I mean, it's very strange how we humans can be fully developed on this intellectual level. Like there's something missing. And it's so wonderful that you've been through this. And now, like your effectiveness, your patients must love you.
Well, it wasn't always the case that they loved me. They liked my mind before, but now it's really awesome. I used to dread going to work, not just my patients, but the office staff saw me as very cold, transactional, utilitarian, like, oh, Fisher's the guy who's going to just try and get into the office in the morning, just get through everything as fast as he can, as quickly as he can, and get through the day. And frankly, I was viewing my patients as objects. And I'm not proud to say that. And I found out as I shared my own shame that I had become someone who cared about people to someone who was just desperate to get through an overwhelming burden of patients in a thankless job, that I wasn't the only one. And this is where the crisis of burnout in our healthcare system is cracking at the seams now, because I was experiencing in one single office what's happening in almost every office everywhere around the world. And I've spoken to physicians in dozens of countries, and it's the same story over and over. And so as I made my own internal shifts, beginning with discovering positive psychology, then diving into meditation, going on silent retreats, then practicing yoga beginning around 2010, 2011, going to Kripalu and other places, 10,000 hours of meditation and body work later, I find that I'm deeply compassionate for myself. I discovered that I can generate compassionate feelings for other people, which I didn't realize you could do that. I know what it means to love now. I didn't before. To embrace my whole self, my whole body, warts and all. And because of that, I intentionally, and now as a trait, I emanate love when I walk into my patient room. Now, they won't all say that. I'm sure there are some, maybe 1 out of 50 or so, that will say, yeah, I still didn't get along great with him, but it's nothing but smiles and hugs and, kisses. And even during COVID, my patients would say, Dr. Fisher, I really want to hug you. And I'd say, okay, let's wash our hands and we can do it anyway. And so, Heather, it's been a real transition. And the interesting part that you might or might not expect is that as I was extending myself out more to my patients to really give their hearts what they were needing, my own burnout was decreasing. Nothing was changing in my office practice, nothing. There were no more staff. In fact, we had doctors leaving. My schedule was more full, but I felt a richness in my own experience as I was becoming a healer in my mind, and rather than a technician, which is what I had. And it was that transition that only happened as I was learning to open my heart. And I don't want to give the impression that I've learned and I've done it. This is a practice that I have to do every day. I'll get into a fight, with my kids or with my wife, or there'll be tension with someone in business somewhere. Every day these things come up, and every day I lean on these practices. I say, how can I nurture my heart, what it needs, so that I can really be a force for light rather than cause more toxic fear and a sense of unsafety in people around me, because I've seen the negative effects of that, both in my patients and also in my thousands of colleagues.
So you're basically like deprogramming the Jersey out of you. No, just kidding. Because I grew up in Rhode Island in a very Italian American culture. So there's something about the vibe of a culture for sure. But it's also just hearing you speak about, and I've shadowed one of my good friends used to work, he's an MD in a very busy dermatology clinic in California. And when I was in Ayurveda school and thinking about, what I was doing with my life, I went and shadowed him one day, and I was just appalled by how little time he had with people. Because when my first consultation is like an hour and a half. And to see somebody go that quickly from person to person, and to know that what I saw was each person that he met with had so many more questions for him, wanted so much more. They wanted to understand what was going on with them so much more than they were able to in that 10 minutes that they had with that doctor, if they were lucky, 15 or 20. And I experienced this as a parent, even when you're in a rush and you need to get something done, there's no time for questions and feelings. It's amazing that you're able to do it. How do you do it now?
Yeah, what you just said there, as a parent, and when you're rushing, there's no time for that. It really struck me that as I dive deeper into the physiology, what happens in our brains and literally in our hearts when different scenarios arise, whether it's a fight with somebody, whether we're rushing, whether we're in the middle of a task, there are switches in the brain that are switching on and off. And when we are rushing and we're oriented towards a specific task, there's a different part of our brain, that social connection system, that can tend to shut down. There are different parts that are active. And so just being aware of that, it's another reason to slow down. It's another reason to go against the grain, to be a rebel in a time when everything is faster and more and better, to say, no, slower, simplicity, enoughness. And I love how you said that. Just the slowing down is the only way to create that space, that emotional space, but also that could create a physical environment for the people around us so that there's the possibility for a new emergent idea, a new idea, that space between us. And to answer your question of how do I do it, on the one hand, I'm very proud of the skill that I've developed in doing it. And I teach people how to do it, all over the place, how to establish trust and empathy within seconds, because the time constraint hasn't changed, Heather. It's the same. Since the 1990s, when the US government decided that doctors should be paid based on a 15-minute visit, do you know how many times that's been changed in the last 30 years? And the time has been expanded? 0. It's the same now. And that's despite the fact that the computer health system, it's only invented in the last decade or two, which has now doubled or tripled the amount of time we have to spend with a patient. And so you're exactly right that it's in the rushing that we miss the details, not just the medical details, but the spiritual, the social, and the emotional details. And so how do I do it? It begins before I walk into a patient's room. I do research, I do homework, I read everything I can about the patient to the point where they're surprised and delighted that I know more about them than any other doctor or clinician has ever known about them. I do deep detective work. I want to know the names of their children, the names of their pets, whatever I can get over the last 10 years of history. So I go in prepared, but I've already created part of a note, so I don't have to write that down when I walk in the room. The next thing I do is before I open the door and come face to face, I do a pause and a visualization practice in order to set my mind and heart in the right direction and move away from the rushing and the worry about the prior patient who had their own heart disease. Because I need to create separation. There has to be a feeling of specialness for this next person. Because if I'm not with them and fully present, they're tuned into it right away. And I learned that lesson the hard way a few years ago. Patients never came back or they fired me.
Meaning like, oh, this isn't just another person whose cholesterol is too high because they're not, following the right dietary regimen. And okay, we're going to end up needing to put a stent in them at some point. And
yeah, I think Atul Gawande called it checkbox medicine, where it's just a checklist. And that's what I was referring to before. Part of the reason I was burned out and part of so many physicians and nurses are having that is this idea of cynicism and depersonalization and what some are calling moral injury. It's this feeling that we're behaving in ways that go against our core nature, which is to connect and to love and to care. Instead, we're forced to act like robots and to move faster in the name of profits. So my practice goes on, and we can talk about more or less, and I prepare myself, I open the door, ground myself with the knocking on the door and the sound of the knock, let it resonate. And then I'm fully aware of all nonverbal cues before the first word is uttered. Get a look into your eyes. I'll notice the color of your eyes as a reminder to myself that there's a spirit behind there. A lot of times you go to the doctor and the first glance is on the computer. So for me, it's about how can I feel the energy that's coming in the room? How can I amplify that energy or match the energy with tone of voice, with posture? And there are a couple of very clear-cut ways to establish an open, non-judgmental, neutral space that within seconds at least demonstrates this feeling that you can be safe here. This is a place where I'm here to help you. And then everything kind of flows from there.
that's so beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I actually have a lot of clients who are doctors. So I know that anybody who's listening to this, first of all, if you're not a doctor listening to this and hearing Dr. Fisher here talk about his experience, it's not easy to be a doctor. And I think that I'm not a doctor, but I've spoken with a lot of you. And we place doctors in this authority role, right? So whenever you place somebody in an authority role, whatever issues you had with mommy and daddy, whatever issues you have with the government, this like kind of all comes up, and we create a power imbalance in these relationships. And so I don't know that patients always see their doctors as people. Like I went into my doctor's office just for a checkup in the last 6 months, and I could tell she was so stressed. I was like, whoa. And I feel bad that I didn't even say anything to her because I know it was supposed to all be about me, but I know she's so much busier than I am. And I mean, she was doing the checkbox thing. I could tell, every question I asked her, she was like rolling her eyes at me. And I know it wasn't because she's a bad person. I know it's because she's so stressed and has so much going on. But I'm just kind of curious as a patient, because I think when you go in as a patient, you want the focus to be on you because you're the one with the problem. But what do you think would be a good thing for a patient to say to really get that doctor's attention?
Yeah. I love that question. And as you were speaking, I was having thoughts in my mind about what my patients do for me. And it never grows old. Each and every time I pause to thank them when they do it. It's very, very simple. You ask your doctor in a moment that they're looking at you, how are you? How are you? How are you doing lately? And that simple question, you may bring the doctor to tears, you might not. But that simple expression of care for someone who has taken on the mantle of caring for others for years or even decades, often in organizations that are quite toxic and abusive, can really mean the difference actually between having a sustainable career and not. You can be the person to restore meaning to that physician's life by simply asking them, human to human, how are you? And Heather, going back to something you said a moment ago about the power differential, I didn't mention this because I lead a 4-hour workshop for physicians on how to establish this empathy, maintain it at the beginning, the middle, and the end of a visit. One of the things is to be aware of that power differential and to eliminate it and to erase it from the moment you walk in the room. And so one of the ways to do that has to do with the literal height position. So if you notice, sometimes doctors will sit on kind of like a high rolling chair and you'll be sitting on a lower squat chair. Well, right there, even if my eyes are 4 inches above yours, you might not be aware on a conscious level, but I'm looking down at you. And I already have a degree, and I already have a plaque on the wall, and there are these feelings in you that you made reference to, and this comes up all the time. And they didn't teach me this in cardiology, but I learned it in psychology. You described transference, which is not just in the hospital or in the clinic, but every relationship we're in. The way we treat our son is often the way we view our father. The way we treat our spouse is sometimes the way that our opposite gender parent raised us. And we're either seeking approval for something that we never got or doing the opposite. And so, of course, it comes up in the exam room. And if we're not aware of that, that can be like a landmine. And so what I do is I sit not at the level of my patient, but often I'll sit below the level. There's a little pull-out stool beneath the exam table. And I'll squat and sit on that. And I'll come really close and look directly up at the patient to say immediately, without words, there's no power differential here. I'm here to serve you. This is not about me or how busy I am. And if I am feeling frustrated, but well before I want to roll my eyes at you, I have to be self-aware enough of what's happening in my own body, that frustration is arising. I have to vaccinate myself against that. Otherwise, if it comes out and you perceive it, it's the end of a trusting relationship, or at least it can be. And so this is that piece of self-awareness that I think all healers, coaches, helpers, and leaders have to have, and we don't get that training.
Wow. I'm loving our conversation so much. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And, kind of going back a little bit more into your experience with the heart and having really a multidimensional understanding of its operation and function and connection to a whole. Are there any really weird things about the heart that you could tell us that people wouldn't expect, or things that might sound intuitive to people, but they don't know that there's actual science behind it? Like, for example, one thing that I've heard, and I don't know if you've seen the research on this, is that when a group of people sing together and they start to harmonize, that something changes in their heartbeats. Have you ever heard this?
As you can imagine, I'm writing a book about the mind-heart connection and specifically the 4 aspects of our heart that we have to reunite in order to live a fully integrated way. And those are the physical, the emotional, the social, and the spiritual. And in the spiritual world, in the world of yogis and mystics, and sometimes New Age, there is a lot of interest about the heart. And part of the reason I'm writing this book is to kind of find out what parts of that are true and what parts of it don't quite jibe with any aspect of science and really have to stay in the world of esoteric mysticism. And that's really interesting for me. So yeah, absolutely. In the same way, Heather, that if you and I were in the same room and we were having, just like now, we're having a conversation, I'll bet that if you measured our heartbeats simultaneously and we had them on the screen right next to our faces here, you could detect shifts in our heartbeats based on this conversation. I know that for a fact because with my patients, I've had my hand on their pulse while I've said one thing or I've said another or I've acted in a certain way. So it's a fascinating science, but we influence each other's heartbeat. Now, there's also talk about this thing called coherence, which is promoted by HeartMath, which is very popular because it helps people really get in touch with their emotions and these feelings of love, kindness, and compassion in a way that isn't otherwise accessible. There are parts of that science that are beautiful. If we breathe more slowly with a prolonged exhale, we activate the vagus nerve, which, by the way, happens when we sing, vagal activation. So I'm giving kind of more of an explanation of why that happens. So there's a lot of reasons why a choir will have some resonance in their heartbeats. Some of it has to do with the vagal activation simply within our body. As we sing, there's an increased pressure in our chest, which stimulates the vagus nerve, activates the gut. So rest and digest deactivates, slows the heart down, lowers the blood pressure. And when I perceive that I'm in a group where I belong, forget about the singing. Any group where I belong can be a meditation group. I did a power core class this morning. They called us a tribe, like that's part of their program. Call us that so that we'll feel that oxytocin boost. So that's yet another way that the vagus nerve is activated, which further slows the heart rate. And of course, if you and I come into a room with different heart rates, both of them are slowed down, we're going to end up close to the same place. So that would be one sort of scientific explanation for that. You asked me if there's any weird stuff. There's lots of weird stuff that's true about.
Wait, but before you go there, if someone else has kind of more of a stress response going on, and then you are with that person, that's also going to affect your heart.
It absolutely is. I want to make a clear distinction here, though. It's absolutely true. However, I'm not at the point where if you and I were opposite each other and there was a black opaque screen, so you couldn't see me, I couldn't see you, we couldn't hear each other. There's no information passing except for the electromagnetic fields, which extend beyond our bodies. And that is one of those interesting facts that some people have heard about, and that's true. If it was only that, there is no evidence that it would affect our heart rates in a meaningful way, or at least a measurable way. And that what I'm saying is if we then remove the screen and you can see the look on my face, you can read what are called micro expressions, the corners of my eye, the corners of my mouth, whether my shoulders are a micro inch up or down. Immediately, your brain is wired to detect whether I feel safe. And in my presence, do you then feel safe too? Then your brain deactivates your sympathetic nervous system and the chemicals associated, puts into overdrive your vagus nerve. And if you believe and follow Stephen Porges's work in polyvagal theory, there's what's called the ventral branch of the vagus nerve. And I don't mean to geek out too much, but this is like what I love, right? Mm-hmm. Hopefully you're into this.
Go for it.
And so when you perceive both verbal and nonverbal and auditory cues, I don't have to say a thing, your heart will be affected. And at the same time, there is energy emitting from my heart, which is entering your heart space and vice versa.
Yeah. I mean, I've taken a lot of pulses too. As an Ayurvedic practitioner, that's how we do the 3 fingers on the radial artery. Typically, it's Nadi Pariksha. And it's super fascinating. I mean, one of the things I found that was so interesting, we would be in groups of 4 in Ayurveda school, and we'd be putting our hands on pulses. And there were 2 of us that were like kind of more phenotypically similar in the group. And then the other 2 were more phenotypically similar. And this was fascinating. In our group of 4 with one patient, 2 of us would always feel the same reading of the pulse. And the other 2 would always feel the same reading of the pulse. They would be different. And I was like, that really fascinated me because our tissues are different densities. There's so much difference in the bodies and how that vibration can be felt through all of the tissues. And then obviously then how it gets processed through the mind after that. But I think there's a lot to touching people that, yeah. And I guess, so you also touch people in your practice?
Very intentionally so.
Yeah.
Very intentionally so. And this is not something that's utilized enough and wisely enough in Western medicine. No doubt about that. So I'm interested in any possible way that we can help people's bodies heal and restore balance. And in the West, in traditional medical school, it's by listening to the words, asking questions, using a stethoscope and doing some tests. There's nothing about sensing someone's energy, diving into their spiritual history, a little bit about social history, a little bit about spiritual history. When it comes to touch, I was lucky. I went to a progressive medical school, which was Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York City. And Mount Sinai was one of the very first in the country to do a really cool experiment back in 1998. And they had this center. It was called the Morshan Center for Patient Experience. So I was like, wait a second. I'm a doctor. What do I care about the patient's experience? I should be thinking about stuffing all that knowledge in my brain. So what they did, and it was Dr. Schwartz, I'll never forget him, he had the idea to hire Broadway actors to come into our medical school in a special studio with a one-way mirror. I would go into the room. It looked like an exam room. The actor would be waiting there for me in the gown. And outside this mirror was my whole class, the teacher, and a video camera. And this was just terrifying and enlightening at the same time, because one of the many beautiful pieces of feedback that I got when I had to debrief, kind of like after a game and you watch the movie, I was embarrassed. The patient said, "You were really nice. I could tell you were really nervous, so I felt nervous too. And the way you touched me, I don't ever want you to touch someone like that again." And immediately I asked him, "Well, what are you talking about? How did I touch you?" He said, "I could see how nervous you were because instead of an even, smooth palm and transmitting warmth, your hands were cold and you grabbed me like a claw on my shoulder, very clinically. And it felt like a spider. It just gave me a very bad feeling right away and I became activated." And so since that time, it's almost like you do the opposite now. If you ever watched Karate Kid, it's Mr. Miyagi. And hand on the shoulder or hand on the chest, hand on the back. So I don't underestimate the power of the healing touch and the warmth that comes from the hand. And I'm going to go out on a limb, and my colleagues will call me crazy, but I believe in the power of Reiki also. And I believe that people who transmit positive, loving energy can have a healing effect. In fact, I just was approached by the chaplains of our healthcare system last week, asking whether I thought, as this is now as an executive responsible for well-being of caregivers, whether it was okay or a good idea for them to take their Reiki training and use it on nurses and doctors, at least as an option. And I said, absolutely. How about yesterday? So getting back to your question about the power of touch, it can be physical touch, it can be non-physical touch, it can be an energetic presence. These all have a therapeutic effect.
That's so great. And, I love talking about how you got into mindfulness meditation and, way back when. And it does seem that in order to really change a system or in order to just improve things, you kind of do have to do things that are a little bit weird. And I think it's like our fear of not wanting to be weird that kind of makes things so horrible in the first place. And there were so many times way back when where yoga was considered, where meditation, and now these things are very commonly practiced. You brought up Reiki, like that's definitely, I think a lot of people don't really understand it. And I remember the first time someone did it on me, I literally thought, it was a massage therapist, I thought she had fallen asleep at the end of the massage because what she was doing was so subtle. I thought it was nothing. I thought she was sleeping. Because at the time, I was not very sensitive. So I couldn't perceive someone doing something subtle to me because I wasn't very sensitive. It wasn't in my awareness. But as my own sensitivity increased from yoga, meditation, all these, changing my diet, whatever, all the things that make it happen, my experience of the world changes. But it doesn't mean that the ones who are more sensitive, we're the ones that have to change the world.
I love that. In fact, you're the second person this week who told me that, because I was communicating. This is a psychiatrist friend of mine. And I just said, I was such a sensitive kid. And I was so sensitive that medical training almost broke me. I would weep in the hallways. And when young people were diagnosed with cancer, and people who know me now know that I'm a pretty sensitive guy. And he just said, there's a power there. There's a power in the sensitivity. And what I love about what you said, and it really resonated with my own experience, what yoga did that meditation didn't do, or at least what one of the 8 limbs of yoga, sort of the asanas, and then later getting into the other limbs of yoga, is it, and especially reading Iyengar and others, it enhanced my sensitivity to all aspects of my body, from my fingertips to the scalp to my toes. And, from his book, Light on Life in particular, and some of the practices there, yoga for me was never about an exercise. It was purely another form of meditation and enhancing the sensitivity of this incredible organ, this sense organ, that we pay attention to a small percentage of, the part that's moving up here, ignoring all the rest of the aspects that are there that, like you said, can help us not only experience the healing of a Reiki provider, but also generate a certain energy that can then create an environment that someone else will be more likely to heal in and to flourish and even to grow in, whether that's our children or our patients or the people we lead on our teams.
Gosh, I want to take a whole class with you on the heart now. I guess if there was one real gem about having a heart, and, we all have one, what would be like your number one piece of advice for people related to their heart?
As you're asking that question, the answer is coming up, and that the piece of advice is to realize that what you are thinking about as your heart is so small compared to how vast the capacity of your actual heart is. Just that first moment of awareness, well, what is he talking about? My heart is right here. I can point to it. I can take a picture of it. That's it, right? And what we know from the ancients and also from modern science is that that's just a tiny glimpse, tip of the iceberg. And the piece of wisdom would be that the heart has many aspects. There are at least 4 aspects of the heart that we have to pay attention to. The physical is obvious. The emotional drives about 90% of the physical heart disease that I see. And I'm not making that up. You can look at the World Health Organization's website and the CDC, and you'll see 80 to 90% of all Western chronic diseases, which account for coronary disease and as the number one cause of death in women and men everywhere in the world, 90% of that is caused not by problems of the physical heart, but by the other 3 hearts. And so my piece of wisdom is to recognize that we're looking at too small of a window when we're thinking about our hearts, and we have to take a whole view to integrate the physical with the emotional, with the social heart, and with the spiritual heart.
Thank you so much. All right, I've been asking some people this question lately, so I'm going to ask you because it seems like a fun one, which is, do you believe in love at first sight?
I do. I absolutely do. And in fact, I'm going to go one further, and I'm going to say I believe in love before first sight.
Ooh.
I believe in love before first sight. I used to think that love was conditional and dependent on a certain interaction or energy that would happen or not happen, somebody's appearance, their background, the way that they would approach me. And then I realized that love is something that I can either generate inside of myself or not. And I actually can choose to do that. And I can choose to love you before first sight. Now, whether or not you love me back, that's your choice.
Wow. Love that one. Okay, last question. What does the wisdom of the body mean to you?
The wisdom of a body is a rebellious concept. We live in a time over the last few hundred years since the Enlightenment and scientific revolution and the Industrial Revolution, where at least the Western world has told us over and over again that the mind rules all, that the thinking mind, the scientific, analytical, rational mind is the end-all and the be-all of the human experience, and we should worship the mind. And for me, the phrase wisdom of the body is saying, no. There's a reason that for thousands of years, mystics and spiritual leaders and scientists and philosophers have all said the same thing, which we managed to go astray of for about 1,000 years. And that is that there is just one heart. There is just one body. The wisdom of the body means that when we tune in to the information coming from within, whether it's the stomach or the heart or the reproductive system, not in a thinking and a cognitive and a word-based way, but in a real felt sense, we return to this present moment, which is the only moment we have to be alive. We escape from the tyranny of anxiety about the past, fear of the future, and rumination that leads to depression. And we enter into this moment only through the body. And for me, that's the beginning of the wisdom of the body. And then it goes on to what are the emotions, the movements within the body, the felt senses, trying to tell us about what's most important, and then using that as a guide to action rather than our first instinct or our first thought, which is so often wrong. We are very frail And if I learned nothing else from my mother, who was a quantum physicist, it's to be humble about what you think you know. And so I'm taking that spirit with me and listening to my body now more than I do with the thinking mind.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for being here with us today. And your book is coming out this year. And tell us how people can reach you or find out more about your work. What's the best way to connect with you and learn more about your work?
Thank you so much. It's really easy. If you just remember one word, Happy Heart MD. It took me a while to learn how to have a happy heart again. And I happen to be an MD that's trying to help other people have happier hearts, because happy hearts are healthy hearts. You'll find me, I'm active most on LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, wherever you want. And the book will be out early next year. And it's called Just One Heart. And that's the message that I want to spread.
So beautiful. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Thank you. This was really a treat. And I love what you're doing. And just, I wish I had your podcast 10 years ago when I was first getting started. It would have helped me a lot.
Me too. I wish I had it.
Thank you.
If you are embarking on a fertility journey and are ready to have your mind blown about what your body is really capable of and how it's impacted by the environment, then check out my book, The Ayurvedic Guide to Fertility. You can actually download the introduction to the book for free on my website at heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. Read the intro for free and then buy the rest of this fertility enlightening book pretty much anywhere books are sold. You know, I get so excited. I get this kind of goosebump feeling when I get a booking from a new client that I haven't met yet. And I get so excited because I know that somebody has made a decision to go really, really, really deep into their healing. Because I know that Ayurveda is not a quote unquote normal thing that many people have access to, at least not in the United States where I live. So I know that when someone books with me, that they've really made a decision that they want to go deep into their healing. And so you could do that on my website at heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. You can book me for either a Ayurveda consultation if you're ready to dive in, or you can also book me for a 15-minute connection call if you're not sure where to go yet. I do have a couple offerings that are not on my website, and we could talk about that. So I look forward to meeting you. Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And meet me here next time on The Wisdom of the Body.